China's most valuable brands. Now this is thoughtful. Hi, I'm Trevor Lai in Shanghai. Our guests on Thoughtful frequently talk about the power of social and digital media in China. But it's important to remember that the companies behind those platforms have become very powerful in their own right. WPP and Millward Brown recently announced the results of its 5th annual BrandZ Top 100 Most Valuable Chinese Brands survey. The 2015 ranking clearly shows a rapid rise in the brand value of technology and tech-related retail brands. The internet service company Tencent has become the most valuable Chinese brand for the first time, and newly listed online retailer Alibaba entered the ranking at number 2. Both brands leapfrog longtime leader China Mobile, which had held the top spot since the ranking launched in 2011. Technology companies have become brand powerhouses, and as a result, the tech category has now surpassed financial institutions as the highest value category, worth $106.9 billion and contributing 23% of the top 100's total value. At the same time, innovation and creativity are flourishing in China, thanks to increasing market competition and the rising demand for innovation from Chinese consumers, who are more sophisticated and better informed. With us today in the studio is Rana, head of Greater China at Millward Brown, to talk about these findings in more detail. Rana, thanks for joining us today. First, let's start with sharing some more highlights from your report and looking at the brand value of all the companies in China for 2015. How has this number changed over the past few years?
The brand value of Chinese brands has been going up over the years. So over the last 5 years, we've seen a 60% increase. And that sort of outpaces the increase in global top 100 brand value, which is about 40%. So yeah, Chinese brands are making sort of faster progress than all brands globally.
And when we look at these Chinese brands specifically, were you surprised to see China Mobile knocked off the top?
Well, not really, and I think you would share that sentiment because it was coming. Globally, we are seeing power transfer from telecom providers over to technology brands. So while they're direct competitor as well, because Weixin obviously has caused a decline in revenues of China Mobile, texting revenues, but overall it's also reflecting the rise in general of someone like Tencent, which is a much more market-oriented brand than China Mobile, which has a strong brand but is still a state-owned enterprise.
And it does reflect the overall trend across sectors of state-owned enterprises ceding ground to these market-driven brands as they rise. So in terms of that trend, do you see that continuing to accelerate across all industries in 2015?
It is likely to continue for the foreseeable future. I mean, state-owned enterprises, some of them are much more competitive than others. Some of the others are monopolies. So obviously, the ones which adapt their brands and adapt their marketing strategies to meet the consumer needs, differentiate, build their brands, will still continue to survive, but others will come under competition. You also see the trend of the government trying to put pressure on state-owned enterprises to deploy their resources properly, because the government wants a higher return on investment from these resources. We also see the government anti-corruption campaign has had an impact on state-owned enterprises. There has been a bit of a slowdown in decision-making, but we expect that to sort of move on and them to become agile again.
Well, there is an adjustment period, I guess.
Exactly.
As people sort of look at the market the way it is today, and also the decision-making, as you've mentioned, and the laws as they've changed and been updated. When you look at broadcasting and entertainment, it seems like some of the state-owned stations, for example, have started to catch up to the digital wave. When we look at other sectors, is there one in particular, like for example banking, that you think is ripe for some leadership change in terms of the brand values?
Absolutely. I mean, banking has been one of the sectors where the state-owned banks have been under the most pressure. For the foreseeable future, we expect them to be, they'll continue to be under pressure, and brand value, they'll be challenged. You know, on one hand, they're being challenged by the smarter private banks, but on the other hand, also by the technology players who have sort of almost become quasi-banks.
Especially with mobile banking.
Exactly, yeah. So it all depends on, you know, who owns that ecosystem and whether state-owned banks remain relevant in the new scenario.
And of course, when we talk about technology, we have to look at the consumer sector, and we look at retail and the rise of digital retail, online retail in China. Obviously, a lot of the players like Alibaba have been making global headlines already. Do you see any lessons that Western brands can learn from these retailers in China?
Well, Chinese brands have been much better at playing the O2O ecosystem compared to Western brands. So, whether it is online players tying up with offline players like Yihaodi and tying up with, Family Mart to use their physical infrastructure. So where else in the world do you have a scenario where, you're taking a metro ride home and then, you scan the Yihaodi codes and then by the time you're home, delivery is already made. So China is sort of miles ahead in some of these areas.
Do you see the West actually catching up, or are there just some inherent characteristics of the market here that allow China to deploy those types of resources at that speed and that cost that the West will never be able to catch up to?
I mean, the West is definitely catching up. For example, you might see drone technology being applied to make home deliveries. I mean, Tencent is experimenting with it. Google will also is experimenting with it. But the question is, does the infrastructure and the state regulations, do they play a role as well in addition to what the brands are doing? And are brands allowed to flourish fully?
Let's take a break. Then we'll be back to hear more from Rana.
经济学人全球商业评论强势来袭，网罗每月商业、金融和科技新闻热点，为下一代全球华人商业领袖专属定制。英语、简体中文、繁体中文3种语言模式，只需一键即可轻松切换。强力智能取词功能支持对任意段落或长句进行单独检索和翻译，海量信息只为您呈现。你的世界决定你的世界。经济学人全球商业评论即刻下载订阅。
Welcome back. I think one of the things that's really interesting about the report is the gap between multinational brands and Chinese brands is closing. And in some sectors, the technology examples that you mentioned earlier, the Chinese brands are actually becoming leaders, recognized globally for their innovation as well as their market results. So do you see a day when the discussion of foreign brand versus local brand doesn't actually become such a big debate, and that consumers will really look perhaps first to Chinese brands and say, I prefer this, and maybe look at some of the foreign brands in a different light?
Consumers are essentially looking for value, and they're looking for brands that deliver meaning to them. So if we look at about 5 years ago, the Chinese brands were much lower. We have a metric called brand power, which is how strong a brand is in terms of its ability to grow in the future. And foreign brands were at about 115 on an index of 100, and Chinese brands on a 95. Now we've seen the gap really narrow down, and Chinese brands have almost sort of caught up. There is one area where Chinese brands are still weaker, though, which is differentiation. So they're well known, they have a good distribution network, they're also beginning to have a good positioning, but they really, really still need to work at their point of difference, because there's a trend of copying each other in China, and it becomes a sea of sameness very soon. So how do you continue to have a long-term brand strategy which stands for differentiation? Because what we also find is that if you're different, then people are willing to pay a premium for you, and it doesn't matter whether you're a Chinese brand or a
Apple being an example of that,
exactly,
as they've reported very stellar numbers,
exactly,
blockbuster numbers.
And you might have thought that Apple is on the way down, but because they've kept investing in that difference and they've stayed true to who they are.
Well, that's actually an interesting debate as well, because there's been the rise of Xiaomi across the global stage, but especially in China. And oftentimes I think the media misquotes them as the Apple of China, but that's not really their positioning. And so it seems like they've got actually two very distinct brand positionings. But as Xiaomi grows and they introduce more products, perhaps in the higher end, do you see them starting to look to become a more premium player, or do you think that they'll stay entrenched in their brand in terms of where they are right now?
Xiaomi's success so far is perhaps more business model based rather than brand strength based. So I think next 1 or 2 years will be a really sort of a crucial time for them, whether they're able to transform into a brand which is not just cool for the moment, but is something that people desire sort of forever and at a premium price. And the second thing is, are they able to build a data ecosystem? And you see them investing in that. You know, they're really looking to become eventually a owner of big data. And if they can sort of make that transition, then they will succeed.
And they've also made a commitment to invest in different categories, not directly producing the products, but really branding the products that are produced by other manufacturers. So when we look at categories, what are the fastest growing ones that you see in China?
We will see any consumer-oriented category doing well. So the categories that have been impacted is obviously because of the government spending crackdown. And as a result, you see a temporary slowdown in alcohol, you see a slowdown in some of the retail and also luxury sector. However, we do see, again, that phase passing where people will eventually still look at brands that deliver value even within these sectors. And there's some brands which are more insulated from the government crackdown than others. So we anticipate those will keep growing.
And at the same time, we've also looked at the auto sector, and you see players like Uber coming in and their Chinese equivalents. Has that put any sort of pressure on the auto industry here in China, which was obviously booming as well for quite a number of years? But do you think that these types of services and things like that will have an impact on the brands of automakers?
That's much more likely to impact the taxi companies, to be honest, something like Uber. Because if you look at Uber, it finally provides a luxury service. And in a way, it's about a service, but also perhaps the brands of cars that Uber uses in a way are better. So it won't really impact the car manufacturers, but it's much more likely to impact the taxi companies, which are, again, state-owned or quasi-state-owned monopolies.
Yeah. Right. Is there anything that surprised you about the findings in the report that really sort of caught you off guard? Because obviously you've been looking at the research and the brands over a number of years. But when you looked at the finding this year, was there a tide shift in any particular area that was a surprise for you?
I mean, obviously the biggest news was the entry of Alibaba into the rankings at number 2, because once they had an IPO, then we could attach a value to the brand. So that has been the biggest transformation. But the other thing is looking at the market-oriented brands in the ranking 50 to 100, which is sort of the second tier of brands. They've been making good progress as well. So these two trends, we see the mega players like Alibaba and Tencent and Baidu continuing to make progress, but also some of the smaller market-oriented brands.
So for 2016, you think players like Alibaba, who have established a foothold this year, will continue to grow in dominance?
Yeah, I mean, it'll be a very interesting year. This year, you see Alibaba valuation is about $60 billion, and you have Tencent at 66. So they are neck to neck, and you know that BAT are all fighting for the consumer ecosystem. So whoever sort of becomes a ecosystem owner is really the one which is going to win out. So next year, you've got to watch out whether it's going to be by Alibaba or Tencent, which is at the top.
Sounds like it'll be a busy year for you then.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Rana.
Pleasure.
That wraps it up for today. Be sure to subscribe to us on Youku, Tudo, and YouTube. You can also follow us on Weibo, WeChat, and Twitter, and join our LinkedIn group. We'll see you again.